Welcome back. We're talking about China's growing influence in Asia. Let's get back to our panel right now. Let's go to Kuala Lumpur again, to Asano. At least the leaders of China and Malaysia signed agreements on railways, energy, defense, and the joint development of Malaysia's naval vessels. That was back in November. How important is China to Malaysia's infrastructure development as well as its military development?
Well, I think China is indeed very important in terms of Malaysia's infrastructural development, because for many years we have relied essentially upon Malaysia's own capital and know-how to develop its, for example, highways and railway systems and so on. And that worked to a certain extent by means of, for example, the build, operate and transfer sort of model. But Malaysia, even though in comparison with China is still a small country, it does have its vast expanse of land and sea. And we do need more, for example, railroad networks and more advanced versions of railroad networks, such as, for example, the high-speed rail being proposed between Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. We also need more advanced ports which can handle larger vessels and so on. And China has, at the moment, is perhaps the only country which has the sufficient both know-how as well as capital which could assist countries such as Malaysia to develop those infrastructure. As to the military cooperation, traditionally China and Malaysia, frankly speaking, did not have a lot of cooperative measures in the military front. But over the past 2 years or so, you saw, for example, there are various Chinese military vessels which are visiting Malaysian ports. You will see, for example, there are more and more of these joint military exercises between China and Malaysia. And now we are even talking about potential purchases of Chinese weapons, as well as joint research and developments of certain military equipments between Malaysia and China. So what we are seeing is, of course, both countries trying to expand beyond the traditional economic cooperation, which have been very fruitful. Yeah.
Richard, what about the military relationship between the Philippines and the United States? You talked a little about that earlier on, but here are two countries that have traditionally had a very strong military relationship. The United States still maintains a military base in the Philippines. Is that changing now, now that the Philippines is looking more towards China?
Well, as our guest from Beijing mentioned, one of the main attraction points of China for Duterte is offering economic development assistance, particularly in terms of infrastructure development in the Philippines. In fact, the Philippines is even well behind other regional states like Malaysia, and yet it's a booming economy, so the necessity for massive infrastructure development is definitely there. Now, regardless of that, the fact of the matter is that there are two major obstacles for Duterte to significantly alter Philippines' relations with the United States. One is public opinion, because the surveys clearly show that America is still the #1 favored country by vast majority of Philippines, while perceptions of China and Russia are still relatively low and have not significantly improved over the past few months. And then, of course, the second issue, and more importantly, is the Philippine security establishment, which is very much tied to America. If you look at all major officials, security officials within the Duterte administration, either they have been trained in the United States or in one way or another, they have a long history of interaction with the Americans. And I think the bulk of the Philippine military, if you look at studies and conversations with them, will suggest that they still prefer America as the #1 ally of the Philippines. And in fact, the U.S. has almost doubled in its foreign military financing to the Philippines from around $70–80 million to around $170 million this year. So U.S. is putting a lot on the table right now. So what I think Duterte is trying to do here is to find a new grand bargain with the two superpowers, whereby he will downgrade relations with U.S. in places where China is sensitive, for instance, joint exercise exercises in the South China Sea, but he will still maintain a level of hedging just in case if things don't work out with China. That is why behind the scenes there's still conversation on how to implement, for instance, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. It will be a very difficult balancing act, and I think a lot will also depend on what concessions and incentives both China and US are willing to offer tangibly in the coming months. So in short, the situation is very fluid, and as of this moment, Duterte is still at the receiving end of this very aggressive courtship by China, by US, but also by Japan.
Right, Sourabh, this was something that you addressed in part last November. You wrote about new US policy, and I'm quoting here, you said, while legal defense obligations to allies will be honored in full, the more hands-off policy towards Asia's foreign relations will diminish confidence in American resolve among its non-allied regional parties, particularly in Southeast Asia. So, as Richard pointed out, this is a balancing act on the part of the Philippines, for one, but how will this affect the geostrategic balance in Southeast Asia?
The way it is going to affect the geostrategic balance, it's actually a really interesting question. The United States has had alliances in Asia and for a very long time, and those alliances have struck very deep roots. Those alliances primarily, though, are in East and Northeast Asia. That was the part of Asia, the Asia Pacific, which was doing so well over the last 50 years. But I would now characterize that as old Asia, and young Asia, which is booming now and doing well, is in the ASEAN states and South Asia, India especially. The alliances are in East Asia, are in old Asia, while the part of Asia which is really booming is now young Asia, where those alliance structures are not that deep. And therefore, this creates immense geopolitical ramifications because these countries have wider latitude to make their own choices with regard to their relations between the United States and Asia. And given that the United States has never quite come to terms with that understanding of the colonial, anti-colonial background by which many of these young Asian states have risen, it's not able to capable of really engaging them the way it did with the Japanese and the Koreans. And so these countries value their sovereignty, value their autonomy, they will do hedging, but the way in which they will interact with China or with any major power is going to be very different from the way that the US is used to in Asia vis-a-vis with regard to Japan and Korea. And so it's something we'll need to watch over a longer period of time, but that alliance structure that the US had will not be easily transferable to the ASEAN countries in South Asia.
Okay, Qinduo Xu, I want to switch now from China's military and strategic influence in Asia to its financial clout in Asia. China is part of two relatively new banks in the region, the New Development Bank, as well as the Beijing-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. What's their role and how important are these banks to China's growing influence in the region?
Well, I think if you look at the two banks, mostly their role is to issue loans to the regional countries because according to the Asian Development Bank, according to their estimate, there's a lack of a huge funding for the next 10, 20 years in terms of the infrastructure development. So yes, there's a lack of funding, and China has a huge reserve, the largest reserve in the world actually. So China is, together with, of course, its One Belt, One Road initiative, China is funding, basically leading other countries to establish such a bank together with the Silk Fund, that's like AIIB and Silk Fund, working together with OBOR here. I think, of course, with the Chinese money, with the Chinese initiative, yes, there's a growing Chinese influence. I mean, naturally, there's influence. But look, what China is doing is really about building roads, highways, airports. So it's about physical connectedness, the link between countries, between regions, so as to further develop economy for the purpose of improving people's living standard and prosperity. China is not not building military bases like in Philippines or in Malaysia or in other countries. No, this is very different from what the U.S. doing in terms of under its so-called pivot to Asia strategy. You see new military bases in Australia, new military bases in the Philippines, and strengthen the military cooperation with Japan, with Vietnam, with India. So I think, for people on the ground, on the street, it's easy to see which way is probably the right way forward for this whole region.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us.